think it's exciting primarily because for 20 years we had a very strong and successful leader in Renee Glover. And you had mayors that cared about public housing. One of the things that I know folks know is when you walk in to see a leader of a government, it matters how they feel about your issue from the beginning, because that impacts how hard a lift whatever issue or whatever you're trying to push is. If I don't care about public housing, if I don't believe that working people and middle income people are essential to the fabric of the city, you've got a different need.
We are at a bit of crossroads with respect to public housing in New York and with respect to affordable housing in the city. And public housing really exists in that broad affordable housing ecosystem. It doesn't really stand alone. And the reality is that for the better part of 30 plus years now, there's been a substantial disinvestment in the creation of new affordable and public housing in this country, and New York has not been completely outside of those realities. And so we have, and reinvesting and preserving what we have. And so there are some steep hills to climb. Having said that, we have some rich history, one which you name in terms of having been well managed. But two has been an environment of incredible support for the importance of permanently affordable housing to New York. And public housing has been the bedrock of permanently affordable housing in the city. And so whether it be advocates, through to even the private sector, there's been a strong recognition that affordable housing is critical to New York and continuing to be a city that works. So I feel good about that. On the flip side is, if you look at the numbers in terms of the demand, our waiting list for public housing is 200,000 people. Our Section 8 waiting list is well over 100,000 people. Roughly 1 million households in New York would qualify for public housing, 80% of AMI or below that are receiving any form of subsidy programs. So the reality is, if we're trying to serve this population that certainly would benefit from affordable housing and from public housing, we have some real challenges.
John, of course you've got this great history, but we New Yorkers remember Sandy and these folk out in Red Hook, in a dark 20-story, 1,000-unit building, in the dark, opening the windows and waving their, white rags to show that they were still in the building. And that was a horrible sight. And I think it must have been devastating for you. But I would like to know, how do you respond, and what has happened since that terrible tragedy in terms of how the public sees public housing and what you all are doing in response?
Well, so a couple of things. Obviously, Sandy was devastating, not just to public housing, but to New York as a whole, and New Jersey and Connecticut and surrounding areas. So we obviously had some shared experiences of pain across the region. Certainly, public housing was a lens to look at the impact on certain populations, particularly on the poor. Much of what people saw was really not an issue with the storm itself. What was a negative reaction to their concern about how many low-income families were living and that they lacked resources at a time of tragedy and need. Now, what were we doing as a collective, government, the private sector, philanthropic sector, to respond to that need? NYCHA is an easy target in the sense that it's highly identifiable and it's responsible for the quality of the housing situation that many of those families were encountering. So on one hand, I understand the outrage and the concern, and I share it as a New Yorker, as an American, and as a human being. On the other hand, I am very proud of the work that NYCHA did during Hurricane Sandy in so many different ways. First and foremost, let's talk about the value of those buildings. They were incredibly well built, right? So the vast majority of our buildings withstood incredible winds, rain, surges, where many other buildings and houses actually were washed away. So let's just start by saying that the people who came before us, who looked at building high quality buildings that could stand the test of time in coastal areas, did something right. The vast majority of people stayed in place, were not displaced because the destruction didn't didn't require that. Having said that, 80,000 people in 400 different buildings were without power, without heat, and without light for some period of time. I wish that didn't happen at all, but the reality is that it did, and the question is, how well did we respond to it? I'm proud that we actually got first of all, 80% of it was back on in a very short period of time, and yes, 20% took longer than we'd like, a few weeks. But the reality is, even in those areas, we got all of the heat, power, and lights restored faster than private landlords in those same surrounding communities. So at some point, you got to be benchmarked against the challenge and the task at hand, and ask yourself, how well did you respond relative to your peers?
So let me put on the table one of the most contested ideas in affordable housing, and that is income mixing. Because obviously we know the research, the evidence is clear about income mixing and the benefits. I think the good news is Hope 6 was based on some strong empirical evidence around the idea of income mixing. However, there is a strong critique of how that has been implemented. And some would say that this is really about getting rid of the poor folks. And I'm wondering, because I certainly know that our friend Renee Glover and I have talked about this, and she certainly, in the Atlanta context, was accused of trying to get rid of the poor folks in this massive Atlanta housing Hope 6 reinvention.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has to do with one tilting too far in the private sector direction without maintaining the political partnership. And so I think that the income mix is still the right path, but it's not the right path without appropriate and robust political involvement by elected officials. Because anytime you do something for a long time and it's successful, you are inclined to take the wheels off and let that process work. And so if I think that there's one thing that we're going to change in the city of Atlanta is that we're going to stay closer, we meaning me and people who are elected, to our execution of these properties to address that issue directly. And when people don't have the ability to speak to their elected officials when you're going through this transformation, it causes that kind of disconnect. Because they didn't elect Renee Glover or Joy Fitzgerald, they elected me. And I think that we've got to stay at it. The other part is this: our emphasis moved away from poor people too much too quickly. And if you want to have an honest conversation, that is really the real deal. So the market rate mixed use works, but the fact of the matter is the success of it has taken us away from putting working people and poor people in this housing and caring more about their direct situation.
We need to be talking about poor people. If you look at the income stagnation that's going on in this country, if you look at the number of people, multiple individuals who are working in a household and still barely above the poverty line, if you look at the numbers that are in poverty, and if you look at the number of children, the reports have just come out on education that now more than 50% of the kids in our schools come from households that are low income. And in the South and in the West, those numbers in some places are high as 70%. And so we're not talking about poor people, then you won't get 80% of the vote. Because at the end of the day, we are increasingly not a middle class society. We're increasingly a society that's stressed economically as families. And then third, I completely agree with him that we can't let the plans of public housing kind of be off on their own without political leadership coming along. If I've done one thing that I could do better, haven't done so, is making sure that the political leadership citywide was on board with many of the fantastic plans that we have in place at NYCHA. And you're not going to succeed if you don't have political support. Certainly I've had the support of Mayor Bloomberg. Without it, we wouldn't have accomplished a lot of what we've done and put together some fantastic plans. But the reality is you need broad political buy-in on a subject that is this fundamentally important.
So I think in Atlanta, we've been fortunate to have had mayors, including multiple predecessors of mine, including Franklin, Ambassador Young, Maynard Jackson, who supported a woman that reformed the agency starting in 1996 under Hope 6. So what the Atlanta success shows, in my opinion, is how important it is to have a leader to set the tone and be totally committed to working people, poor people, and middle-income people's housing, and then to have someone who can execute on the vision. Because I don't run our housing entity on a day-to-day basis, but I do provide the political support for the transformation that has occurred in Atlanta, which is one of the best mixed-use models in the United States of America.